So like I said, I'm going to be dealing with the tricky and rather prickly topic of incompatibility in the workplace, simply because this topic seems to be coming up more and more in the cases that we are conducting. It's coming up in different forms and features, but certainly there's elements of incompatibility becoming much more commonplace in the disputes and the conflict that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and the cases we're assisting clients with. And it's on that basis we thought we'd deal with this topic as best we could, and also because there's been some recent recent judgment in the Labour Appeal Court that has squarely dealt with this issue and the definition of incompatibility. As always, this is going to be a very short, concise presentation, just looking very quickly at the case, one or two critical cases. We're going to be just looking at some observations from our side around incompatibility in the workplace. We're going to give you a couple of case studies. We won't pronounce on them, but just kind of the kinds of cases we've seen coming up. And then we're going to very quickly go into questions from yourselves and discussion points from yourself that we're hoping that you can share with us so that we can that will assist in understanding incompatibility in the workplace. So I'm going to go straight into it. In my last webinar a couple of weeks ago, I dealt with the issue of poor performance. And I'm going to just recap a couple of principles about that because it squarely deals with this issue of incompatibility. So moving on, just to summarize, and I hope everyone knows this kind of diagram very well by now, is the reasons for dismissal. We know there's 3 reasons one can dismiss. That would be for misconduct, incapacity, and operational requirements. Misconduct is where somebody's done something wrong. It's a fault dismissal. In other words, it falls on the fault of an employee in the way they've conducted themselves, and that has resulted in their dismissal. Incapacity and operational requirements are commonly referred to as no-fault dismissals. In other words, it's not the fault of the employee that they've been dismissed. Operational requirements is obviously your things like your retrenchments and has got to do with the operational requirements of your company, while incapacity deals with the incapability or your incapacity of an employee to conduct their particular functions. And that's broken up, has always been broken up between ill health and poor performance. Ill health is where somebody's unable to do their job because they're simply too ill to do it. And poor performance is they're unable to do their job because they don't have the capability to do it. And they're unable to meet the performance requirements of that job. And where the courts have squarely, and certainly the recent judgment is squarely put incompatibility is a form of poor performance. And has to be dealt with as a performance issue, not as something which we've seen over the years. Our courts and our arbitrators have kind of looked at it falling into operational requirements or incapacity. Where did this animal of incompatibility fall? Wasn't quite clear. Some even put it into a form of misconduct. But the courts have now said squarely this is a performance issue. So it is dealt with in that context, and that's where I'm going to be placing it. Now, the case law that I speak of, the more recent judgment, it was published last year in 2020. It's Zeda Car Leasing versus trading as Avis Fleet versus Van Dijk. This was a case heard in the Labour Appeal Court. Just so you know, we will in the chat group upload this judgment for your information so that you can read it in your own time. It's a good judgment to read, but it really more deals with an operational requirements and procedural issue around operational requirements and incompatibility. But this one paragraph in the judgment phrase it deals with the incompatibility issue. And this case concerned 2 managers which had a relationship that was highly conflictual. They were in the same department, they dealt with each other, but their relationships itself was highly problematic. The company initially brought in a facilitator to attend to the conflict between them, but then did a bit of a strange double take and started dealing with it as an operational requirements and sent the managers a letter saying that they had decided to combine these two management positions into one, and presented it as what the court referred to as a fait accompli, that one of the jobs would become redundant. And they asked the two managers to apply. I don't want to go into the details of that, but if in essence, the Labour Court and the Labour Appeal Court both found that it was procedurally unfair as an operational requirements dismissal of Van Dijk, and they awarded compensation. The compensation was slightly reduced by the Labour Appeal Court in their decision, but certainly it was found to be procedurally unfair. But what the court did say in this particular judgment was that this was in fact a case of incompatibility. And it's in that basis that they went and explained incompatibility and what it involved. So it's a lovely quote saying it's the inability on the part of an employee to work in harmony within the corporate culture or with fellow employees. And here it squarely points is that it says the prevailing view is that incompatibility is a species of incapacity because it impacts on work performance. So it places it there. If an employee is unable to maintain an appropriate standard of relationship with his or her peers, subordinates, and superiors as reasonably required by the employer, such failure or inability may constitute a substantively fair reason for dismissal. So it talks a little thereafter in this effectively what I see as a summary of what our law is about the procedural fairness, that they have to identify that the relationship is affected, propose remedial action, and give the employer an opportunity to remove the incompatibility before you can even consider dismissal. So those are very important steps and very much mirrors what you see with a poor performance procedure for dismissal, is that in poor performance, you have to identify the standard, you have to tell the employee that they've not met the standard, and the employee needs to be aware of what the standard is. And in the event that they're not meeting the standard, the employee must be given a reasonable opportunity to meet that respective standard. And the same procedure applies with incompatibility in terms of how the court is phrasing this. The also important factor that's come up here is that it's for the employee, the employee must be responsible or have contributed substantially for the disharmony. It can't be an external, extraneous circumstance that's causing that disharmony. So very important judgment, and very nice to get some certainty about placing it into incompatibility. Now, moving on to the other judgment that's of interest, and this is the Jabari versus Telkom SA. Now, this is a 2006 judgment. I should just mention as an aside is that incompatibility is not a new concept. It's been around for many years and was even dealt with at the industrial court stage prior to the Labour Court, the time of the Labour Court and CCMA. This issue of incompatibility was coming up. So certainly not a new concept. But what we are seeing is I anticipate a large number or significant increase in the number of incompatibility dismissals in the workplace going forward, and that will be attended to in our courts as well. But coming back to Jabari, Jabari is an older judgment than the Van Dijk one, but certainly echoes the same principles that we see in Van Dijk, is that it also squarely put it as a species of incapacity, and also I found importantly recognize that relationship, it relates to a subjective relationship, that there's a lot of subjectivity coming with relationships, and that maybe makes it that much more complex. And it's the employee's inability or failure to retain cordial and harmonious relationships with their peers. And interestingly, I love this last bit of item number 1 there. It's amorphous, nebulous concept based on subjective value judgments. Now, I think all of you are scratching your heads and thinking, how do you set a standard for relationship among peers? And that's what I asked myself, and I've spoken to a lot of colleagues about, and what this is about today. But also, it says the prerogative to set reasonable standards pertaining to the harmonious interpersonal relationships in the workplace falls with the employer, which is interesting. So even in 2006, judgments are coming through about setting these standards. And finally, is the other point that's crucial is when there is an employer believes that there is incompatibility, you can't go with a gut feel. You have to say, show that there's independent corroborative evidence to substantiate the incompatibility of the relationship, which again, there is subjectivity around that as well. So very interesting, very nice judgment. And Colleen will be uploading this judgment onto the chat group as well for you to have access and read at in your time. So moving on, I've touched on a little bit around why that incompatibility is coming to the fore. But why is this the case? Why is this such a topical issue at the moment? And here's some of our suggestions that we've brainstormed at Tokiso. We think that there has been a fundamental shift over several years now in the nature of relationships in the workplace. There's also been a shift in what's an acceptable management style, where many years ago, or a few years ago, a more authoritarian type style of management, a top-down approach was the way that things were done. Certainly, I think in the workplaces these days, that sort of style is very much frowned upon. And we've seen a much more greater focus on teamwork, collaboration in decision-making, and the need for more harmonious relationships as one gets that collaboration and teamwork. So that shift certainly may bring to the fore incompatibility issues much more readily. We also think that the need for inclusivity, and that's a real term I use around diversity issues, and requiring inclusivity in a workplace has brought to the fore some personality incompatibility issues with that principle in particular. We've also seen a rise of awareness in the misconduct of bullying, and obviously we've seen the draft Code of Good Practice around violence in the workplace. It's been recent. That was published last year. I think it was in August last year for commentary. And bullying, I do think there is a bit of an overlap around incompatibility and bullying in the way it's perceived. And bullying, I do think, is going to be the big ticket item that we see coming through in the workplace and in the courts over the next few years as a big ticket item that's worth watching as the jurisprudence is developed around that. We also think as Tokiso that the shift towards automation has increased the need for relationship, influencing, negotiating, problem-solving type skills. The focus is way more on team efforts, problem solving, engaging with people much more than ever due to the automation in workplaces. This is a point raised by a colleague of mine as well. Social media places employers on blast. And I love that term. I thought it really kind of symbolizes what happens to employers where something goes wrong in the workplace. We find that it's recorded through people's smartphones, and up it goes onto social media, and employers are put into the invidious situation of not only dealing with that fallout within the workplace, but also in the public at large. So social media plays a big role in everything. You have to assume these days that everything is recorded, by the way. So this is one example, is where things go wrong and relationships go bad. Invariably, somebody's pulling out a cell phone to record it. Macro societal issues such as COVID and other societal ills, if I can call it that, also have brought out gremlins in the workplace around compatibility issues, we believe. And finally, recruitment practices still focus we are still seeing a large focus on skills rather than personality, style, culture fit, values, etc. Now, I know that employers will say, no, that's not the case. But I can tell you what's happening in a lot of interviews. The question is asked of an applicant is, Can you tell me about your management style? And what does the manager, the applicant say? Oh, I've got an open door culture and I listen to people. I believe in hearing everyone's voices. Now, that's good and well to say it, but do you actually practice it is a very different thing. And certainly I think that where people say the right things in interviews, people take it, or prospective employers take it at face value without actually interrogating it much more readily and much more appropriately to see if that individual has the appropriate fit, culture fit and value fit for their particular environment. So those are our kind of list. I'm sure you could add a few to this list as well on why this is coming to the fore. So the issue of distinguishing incompatibility, and we thought this would be a useful thing, is what the courts over the years and arbitrators and employers and employees alike have all struggled with trying to categorize incompatibility. Now we've got an answer from the Labour Appeal Court, but why has it been so difficult to do this? Now, there's a lot in common, which is why the Labour Court probably placed it into this category, is maintain harmonious working relationships. It has to be a performance criteria. In other words, if you're going to hold somebody to the standard of a harmonious relationship, you need to make it as part of their performance criteria. The process is the same as per performance. Our performance issues is you have to set the standards, you have to be aware of the standards, you have to create the opportunity to meet the standards for that particular employee. It must be the employee's conduct that's be the primary cause of the disharmony. Very much like poor performance. You can't blame the poor performance of the employee on an extraneous or external criteria. It has to be their performance that is the problem. As with poor performance, evidence is required. It can't be a feeling of the employer. There has to be that you can show that due process has been followed, that they've been given the opportunity to meet the requirements, and you must have a record of that and evidence of that. Same with incompatibility. So a lot of in common. And finally, the business and economic imperatives of the employee are to be taken into account as it is with poor performance. So it is too with incompatibility. So looking at incompatibility, why do we scratch our heads about it? And I hazard that these are the reasons why. How does one set standards for relationships? That's the first question. Relationships are so difficult to measure, and the impact of disruption, of disharmony and bad relationships is also very difficult to measure. Now, speaking to specialists in culture development in organization, culture specialists, they are saying to me, and I'm not one of those specialists, I need to emphasize that, that's not my area of expertise. And we've got several of our panelists at Tokiso that specialize in culture assessments and relationship building, are saying to me that yes, it is measurable. There's ways in which to determine standards for relationships, particularly in relation to behavior that falls within the purview of the culture of an organization and the values of the organization, and ways to measure that behavior to see if it reflects the culture and the values. And that needs to be brought into the KPIs of an employee. It's not good enough simply to say, oh, you must have good relationships with your colleagues. You need to actually specify what that standard is and how that is going to be measured. Disruption is difficult to measure as well, but very quickly employers know where people are causing problems. And we hope that through our examples, this will kind of demonstrate that. So this is why we think this is difficult, and why employers and employees alike are struggling with this concept of incompatibility. Now, let's move to some case studies. Now, I'm going to go through 4 rapid case studies, and then we're going to get to some tips from Tokiso, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to put some questions to this webinar. So moving to the first case study. We call it when grievances and incompatibility collide. This is an employee. Let's call her Candace. Let's call this employee Candace. Candace does not participate in team meetings and team events. When she is there, she's not present and doesn't actually engage in the topics that are being discussed, and is often simply not there. Candace complains all the time to everyone. She's lodged 3 grievances in the last year. She seems to, and has ranged from various issues. She's often ill, and she challenges any issues that raised with her regarding her conduct or her performance. Now, this is the kind of case that we often get. We're asked to investigate. There's a complaint against her, or we've called in as Tukisa in terms of one of the grievances or 3 of the grievances to try and attend to this. And the question is this a incompatibility issue with the values and the culture of the organization? Now, before I break this down, one of the major issues we see with employers when we get to a dispute side point of view, at a dismissal level or a disciplinary inquiry level, even at a grievance level, is that employers, as we raised in our previous webinar, often fail to categorize the crux of what the real issue is and analyze what's causing the conflict. And they don't categorize it as incompatibility, poor performance, misconduct, or even potentially an operational requirements issue. They tend to leave it messy and not try and identify the core issue. And with this case, Yara is an employee who doesn't seem to be fitting in, doesn't seem to be engaging. And invariably, if this is not impacting on her relationship KPIs, it certainly may be impacting on her performance, her actual other deliverables within the workplace. And it's incumbent on the employer to find out and try and probe what is causing the issues. Is this maybe a health issue? And we've dealt with mental health issues, which we've mentioned before. We've seen a huge increase in mental health issues in the workplace. Is this a mental health issue? Is this an ill health issue? Is this a performance issue, or is in terms of other KPIs, or is this a performance issue in terms of relationship, behavioral issues that do not fall within the realm of the culture and the values of the organization? Now, this could be any of those, but it's for the employer and incumbent on the employer to try and investigate this and get to the bottom and get a way forward on this sort of matter when this does arise, and as early as possible. But this is often the kind of thing we're finding in the cases we're doing for employers such as yourself. Next one is, our example is the manager nobody wants to work with. Another common case we see. This is a manager, we're going to call him Jabu I'm going to call him Jabu today. Jabu is a manager in the company. He's a high performer and seen as the executive team as their high performer. He is results driven. He gets his way. He works hard. He's moved up the ladder very quickly. And Jabu also, on the converse, is seen high numbers of grievances in his particular department. And many of those grievances are against him and his conduct towards employees. Or other things related to him. There's a high turnover of staff in his department, and there's also lots of rumors of improper conduct that nobody is often willing to raise. And this is the kind of scenario we've seen coming up in cases as well. We obviously made it generic, not specific to one particular case, but these are the kinds of things coming up. Now, Jabu as a manager, if he's got KPIs that are exclusively results driven, exclusively around the specific targets that are not relationship driven, obviously he's going to be doing well in his KPIs. But if you had a culture, relationship fits and how that fits and how he's doing and assessments in this, then you will find that job actually would not be doing that well in delivering on his KPIs. And in fact, there could be a compatibility issue here. Is it that simply that he lacks management skills, and that could be a performance issue and a training issue? Or is it that he's just incompatible with the culture and the values of the organization and is unable to meet those requirements? What is needed here? Is it training? Is it where he's told his behavior is unacceptable, you've got this problem and you need to improve on this, and we're going to measure you based on the comfort levels and the happiness in your department? Or you deal with it as a training issue and a development issue? Or do you deal with it as a conduct issue, in that it may well come out through allegations of bullying and other forms of discrimination and abuse in the workplace? It could manifest as that as well. And it's for employers and unions to try and understand how it's been framed and deal with it as such. Get to the core of what's really causing it before deciding on how to deal with it. So that's that case study that we see. The next one, which is coming, we've seen a couple come through recently, is what I refer to as the technophobe example. Here you've got a manager, I'm going to call him Jack today. Jack is a technophobe. He's in an environment, a company where their strategy has been to implement automation in all its functions over the last 2 years and has been doing so aggressively. Everything's automated, right from their HR systems down to their shop floor systems. They've implemented an online information management system. They're required to be ISO compliant, as is Tokiso, by the way. And the average age, interestingly, there's been a fundamental shift in the profile of individuals and the employees in the workplace from an average of 52 to 34, which is a huge jump in the last 5 years as the company's grown. This employee's been at the company for 25 years and has been in this same management position for many, many years. This employee still prints out all the emails, writes his responses on the emails, and gives it to his secretary to type and respond on his behalf. He's unable to fully utilize his computer, which he has one, and is unable to grasp the importance of technology and information management. He still has large files. I think you know what I'm talking about. The employee is low energy and he's slow to respond to issues simply because of his lack of in embracing technology and being able to engage on emails, etc., instantaneously, as we are expected to do these days in so many workplaces. And in the workplace, there are jokes about the employees abound. This also comes up, abound by in the office due to his or her style. And this is the gossip mongering we see so often as part of conflictual situations in workplaces. Now, the question around this is somebody who is incompatible with this new workplace, doesn't fall within his behavior does not fall within the values and the culture of this organization, which has undergone all these changes? Or is this an operational requirements issue? Or is this a misconduct issue where you say, this is what you have to do. You actually need to respond quickly to your emails. If you can't use your own emails, that's your issue. We've given you the tools, it's your problem, you must come on board. So which one does it fall into? And that's where the probe comes in. But I think incompatibility may be one of the issues that squarely could fit into, should it be probed further. The fourth example, which we wish to raise as a common theme, as an example, is incompatible to work from home, which came up as a question in our last webinar, and certainly we've seen coming to the fore more and more, where an employer expects their employees to work from home, as I think many of us do. This employee was meeting all the KPIs in 2019 when they were working from the office. Their job has changed not in any way whatsoever. It's the same job they were doing in the office, they're expected to do at home. the employer has provided all the necessary tools to work from home: Wi-Fi, computers, desks, telephone, technology, everything required to work from home. The only thing has changed is that the environment has changed, that the employee is working from home. The employee is now not meeting KPIs. The employee is not always available on emails. They just don't answer emails on time like they used to. They don't seem to be always available on their phones, despite working from home and being given specific office hours. And the employee seems almost disconnected or unwilling and unable to use online tools to engage with their colleagues and their boss. So the question is, does this now become a performance? Do you deal with this as a performance KPI, performance incompatibility? Is it misconduct for not responding to emails? Is it a form of misconduct when somebody doesn't do that? And that again comes down to requiring to go back down to seeing what is the crux of this, trying to speak to the employee, dealing with them, trying to understand why they're not able to meet it. And it may well lead to that this person's no longer compatible with the new culture and the new values of the company of working remotely. And that may well fit into an incompatibility dismissal should they be unable to meet KPIs working from home. Of course, one of the major issues is working from home now a permanent feature of the workplace or a temporary feature? Because that would certainly come up as whether dismissal would be appropriate in the circumstances. So with those four examples in mind, and I know I have not answered the questions, I've rather probably put more questions into your head around with these examples, I'm going to move to the tips from Tukisa. And this is really coming from what we do. So our tips for around incompatibility is this: identify the conflict points and the triggers as early as possible. The earlier you identify the triggers, the better. Our experience with incompatibility is that often it's years into somebody's employment that incompatibility is picked up, where somebody's been moved, when somebody gets a new manager, that these issues start coming to the fore. Because employers, and this is a common feature throughout the world, not just in South Africa, employers avoid rather than deal with things, or more specific, managers avoid rather than deal with things up front. Train your employees on relationship and conflict management. This is something which people assume you can manage relationships and you understand how relationships work in the workplace. But often, especially with young employees, they don't have this experience. And there's an expectation that somebody's coming into a job with an understanding of what's expected and how people engage. And that extends to what you expect of relationships, as an employer expects of a relationship when somebody joins the organization. And we talk about conflict management. We've done a webinar on conflict management. It is available should you want it. We've done it's a 45-minute webinar on how to manage conflict in the workplace. But you can put employees on conflict management training, which Tukisa offers, which may assist in trying to deal with conflict at an early stage. Another way of doing it is to provide tools to deal with different approaches. So people have a better understanding of working with different styles and different people, different personalities, and different approaches. Tools such as insights, Tukisa does offer insights, and this basically equips teams with understanding the different profiles of individuals, so you're better equipped to work with individuals within your team. So please do ask us about these sorts of tools. Another tip is determine the nature of the real underlying issue, which I've said in the examples, as early as possible. And see if it's simply an incompatibility issue or is it something else. Incorporate KPIs into KPIs, coherent tools to measure behaviors aligned with values and relationship standards within the organization. In other words, get advice on this. Give us a call about it if you don't understand this, and or you want some input around how this should be dealt with. Or and we can appoint. We've got panelists who specialize in this area. on how do you assist in getting a facilitated discussion on setting these particular standards around what's to be, how relationships are measured. Try to correct the conduct through proper interventions. Don't just avoid it. Because often what happens is it manifests through disputes such as bullying and through improper behavior or allegations and grievance of bullying, other forms of harassment, other forms of or high levels of turnover before it's actually dealt with. When it's seen that there's a problem, deal with it through proper independent interventions and get it early on and use those interventions to identify the real issues. If there is incompatibility issues identified, frame this within the standards, values, and culture of the organization. Don't say, oh, they're just not getting on. We don't like them. They're causing problems. They're problem people in the organization. All those sorts of terms are not helpful. Don't call people problems. They're not problems. They're people. They just maybe are incompatible with the standards, values, and culture of the organization and need to be told that there's incompatibility and given the opportunity to meet the required standards of compatibility and harmony within in your particular workplace. And review the nature of disputes that are arising. Are you seeing an increase in grievances, hearings, resignation, wellness issues? These are usually triggers that there is a problem of incompatibility in a particular department. So if HR can identify, sees these trickling in a lot faster than normal, then it's possible that you need to do a culture assessment or see if something's going wrong around a compatible, harmonious workplace in that particular area where it's arising. And finally, as we always say, is please phone to KISO in the event that you are concerned or need process advice on what to do. We will never advise you on a particular substantive matter. It's not a place to do. That's for a panelist to determine and assist you with. But as to KISO, as an organization, give us a call and we will certainly direct you on what process to use to address your particular matter. And as you can see, we readily give out our details, and it's on that basis that I'm going to hand over to you and see if there's any questions. And I see they're coming through fast and furious on the screen. It's on my screen. I'm going to just start with the questions, which are always my favorite part of the webinars. Ingrid asked, in my training and writing, I suggest that the definition of incapacity generally should be the employee is incapable of doing what is expected of his or her due to circumstances beyond their control. This would include poor performance, ill health, injury, incompatibility, incarceration, and loss of statutory qualifications. I suspect this is Ingrid Lewin that's talking because wisdom only comes from her. Such wisdom can only come from somebody like her. So absolutely, it's a lovely, simple definition. And as we've always said, and Ingrid would, this confirms what Ingrid says, keep it simple. Don't go into all the legalese and try and get complex. It only makes your life more complex as an employer or an employee. Another question put forward is the procedure for dealing with incapacity, or a comment is the procedure for dealing with incapacity due to circumstances beyond the control of the employee would be to be the same for poor performance as described by Tanya, particularly looking for alternatives, which now may include getting a difficult employee to work from home. Yeah, that could. So that's Ingrid as well. Yes, absolutely. Also, it may well be that somebody deals well by themselves or is able to perform by themselves, or perform well from home, but not within a team. And is that something which the employer can accommodate? So it needs to be dealt with correctly, as suggested, as it's a no-fault, even an incompatibility dismissal would be a no-fault dismissal. So you need to find ways to try and accommodate that employee in whatever way is possible and see if you can adapt something within the organization to accommodate their particular incompatibility. Sandhya asked, for senior management, this is not explicit in the performance standards, but is embedded in the core management criteria, especially as part of people management. Is this case, in this case, does it still need to be clear and specific as a standard? Now, I haven't dealt with senior. It's a very, very interesting point you raise, Zandile, is how is incompatibility dealt with for senior management versus more junior employees in the organization? And I agree with you, it is dealt with differently. Like with performance issues, senior managers are expected to come with those particular skills, that there's less of an obligation on an employer to expect the employer to offer support and means to meet particular standards. So there's a much more greater obligation for the senior manager to already meet those standards and have those particular skills when they join the organization. And that, in my view, I agree with you, extends to relationship issues. My concern around not incorporating it into senior management performance standards is that how do you measure when push comes to shove and you're sitting before a chair? How do you show and demonstrate that that senior manager has not met those standards? Because it will not be good enough to simply say, it's my gut, they're not getting on with us. You're going to have to demonstrate through evidence that that person has not met the required standard of relationships, of holding harmonious relationships, and that it's materially impacted on their performance and they've not met the required standard. So yes, it is inherent, and it's expected that they've already got those particular harmonious relationship skills, but you still have to have sufficient evidence to show that they are causing, their conduct is the primary cause of the disharmony that's being created in that particular workplace. Okay, Anonymous has asked, can behavioral issues impacting on the relationship with others in the workplace truly be attributed to incompatibility? Can behavioral issues fall within mental health? And if so, would you not be entering into the reign of ill health? I think that this is a fascinating point, and I think I agree with you, is we are often finding that, yes, the answer is yes, it could be an ill health issue. It may be that you're dealing with somebody who is a narcissist, or somebody who is deeply depressed, and that's why is drawn within themselves and is deeply depressed. And we've seen, as I said earlier, a huge spike in mental health cases coming through our doors or through our computers. I can't use doors anymore, only our computers. And no doubt, mental ill health has come to the fore, has got greater, has had a greater impact on the workplace because of COVID, for whatever reason. But I do believe that there could be a big overlap between incompatibility and ill health. I want to raise something around ill health, which makes it much more difficult to deal with, and I've dealt with this in previous webinars. With ill health, where an employer identifies a problem, and this is why it distinguishes from poor performance issues as well, where an employer can manifestly see there's a problem with an employee in the workplace. They go to the employer and say, I can see you struggling. Can we help? Have you got an issue you wish to raise? And the employee shuts them off and says, I'm absolutely fine. I don't have a problem. Stop bothering me about this. It's none of your concern. What can the employer do in those circumstances? Their hands are somewhat tied. If the employee refuses or denies that they've got a problem, which we often see, what can the employer do? They can't impose assistance. They can direct and say, can I suggest you go to the wellness center? Can I suggest you seek help? But if the employee refuses to acknowledge they've got a problem, their hands are tied. And in that way, we are seeing that issues that could potentially be mental ill health issues are arising potentially as incompatibility or as a poor performance issue or even as a misconduct issue, in that the person's absent or whatever. But certainly, I think you're 100% right, there could be overlap there. Can incompatibility, this is another interesting question, from Anonymous, can incompatibility be approached in a similar manner to that of universal access? Would those required requirements work as a standard for testing for an employer's ability to reasonably accommodate the employee? Well, I think when we talk, for those that don't know, we talk about universal access to a workplace. In other words, it's accessible to and inclusive of all employees, no matter what your lot in life. And some people confuse it with use the term disability access, etc. The appropriate term is universal access. So when you have a workplace, you're required to have it universally accessible to no matter what the lot of that particular employee, to ensure inclusivity. Now that means that your physical workplace needs to be accessible, your websites, your technology needs to be accessible, and there's ways of determining that, by the way. Does it mean that you need to make it accessible in that if somebody's incompatible for your values and to your culture, do you need to adapt your culture and values to accommodate that particular employee so that it's accessible to them? And I would say it depends. It depends if your values and your standards and your culture is not inclusive, is unfair in the way that it excludes other people. But I don't think that if you're, for example, if you have a value that respect is one of your values, and one of your managers, in the way that they're conducting themselves, is disrespectful of workplaces, you shouldn't be expected to accept that sort of behavior and make it say, well, it's incompatible with our values, so we're going to have to adjust our values to accommodate that particular incompatible behavior. I don't think that's expected of you. So my answer is, you need to go through the process of thinking through these things in a clear, concise way to make sure you're universally accessible, make sure that you have an inclusive work environment, but it does not mean that you have to adjust your culture and value to include unacceptable or incompatible behavior with your particular values and culture. Let me move on. Very interesting question, and I'm actually going to give it a lot more thought, by the way. Could the inability to keep up with technology be seen as a disability? I don't have an answer for that. It'll be very interesting if that went before courts. But I do think that could be an inclusivity issue, and whether it could be a universally accessible issue is interesting as well. Could one see it that you should be able to, by forcing people to use laptops, emails, Zoom, is that excluding certain people? I'm not sure, and I don't know the answer to that. But in today's day and age, if you have an employee that's unable to use emails, computers, Zoom, etc., it is going to be it is going to create incompatibility with that particular workplace, particularly as remote working becomes more and more of the norm. Even if there was no COVID, it's going to become more and more of the norm. Seller asks, regarding this old man, who's to blame, himself or the employer? And I assume you're talking about that earlier case. I'm actually going to go back to it, Seller, so that you can, sorry, I think it was the technophobe one. The man, in my opinion, the employer's the man performs, but the employer has not ensured that he's taken along with the company changes. And yes, that's correct. I think, and this is why I put up these examples, is that there's not a right or wrong answer to anything. This is what makes our job so difficult in the workplace. It makes working in workplaces so complex these days, is that there is no right or wrong answer, and it depends on the circumstances. And I think one thing incompatibility does, it elevates the individualistic nature of each and every conflictual situation that much more. And you need to probe this sort of case. I agree with you, Selo, is that this sort of case needs to be probed. What has the employer done to assist this particular employee to come along with the new culture? What change management has been implemented to help with the automation and to have acceptance in the workplace of automation and to upskill this particular employee? Just to assume he's in the context of all of that, is this person incompatible? Or is this a matter, and one would look at it as, if it was incompatibility, you'd say, well, what standard has this employee met? he's not responding quickly, he's not engaging with the automation and with technology. Has the employer said this is a requirement of the job? Yes or no? The answer may be no there. And thirdly, has the employer given the means and given the support to meet those required and their new standards? So I would think that the obligation to support an employee to meet the new standards is that much greater. Have you offered that support? And if the answer is no, you can't dismiss somebody for this particular incompatibility or this performance issue. Okay, Anita's asked, could we please be given a few examples of how to measure behavioral issues as part of KPIs? I did say to you, this is not my area of expertise, but apparently, and what I'm happy to do, Anita, is to send all those that are participating on this webinar, and there's a large group, is maybe a set of toolkits and tips around this particular issue. So we will make a note of your question, and because of time constraints and because that's not my area of expertise, I'm going to ask that we come back to you on that. And anyone's welcome to call Takiso around that and ask for that information as well. Okay. Anonymous has asked, I've been asked to take the next point is, what if there are underlying mental issues which are impacting on the employee's performance, but the employee has not officially declared this to the employer and refuses to consent to the employer to assess this? If the employee refuses to bring the employer into their confidence, or more specifically, which I see more often, I'll be honest with you, anecdotally, is that employees have not acknowledged themselves that they've got a problem. But the employer can see it, the employees around them can see it, but they just say it's everybody else's fault. If that happens, the employer, in my view, unless anyone's got a different, I'd love to hear views on this, but I think that your hands are relatively tied and you have to look at it as a performance or a misconduct issue, sadly. And it's so sad in those circumstances because you can offer the help, but if the employee doesn't take the help, you can't force it upon them. So you have to then categorize it as one of the other forms of performance or incapacity matter. Is there a distinct difference between dismissal during probation and incompatibility? As we know, the hurdle's much lower to dismiss during probation period than during when somebody's confirmed in employment. Now, probation is exactly there to see if somebody's compatible, if somebody meets the requirements of the job, etc. So what usually happens is somebody gets a contract of employment, say your probation period is 3, or usually you tend to find probation periods 6 or even 12 months with very senior employees. And during that probation period, somebody's assessed to see if they met the KPIs of the job, offered the necessary support. And like I said, that support is determined by the seniority of the position. As more senior you become, the less support to meet the requirements is required. And finally, that includes compatibility. So if somebody's completely incompatible for the job, you pick it up during probation, you have to give them an opportunity to correct it. But if they don't correct, you have every right not to confirm their employment at the end of probation, or even potentially extend their probationary period with good reason, in order for them to, if you believe that they could actually potentially meet the requirements in terms of their behavior and behavior complying with the values and standards and culture of the organization. Could race and culture be a source of incompatibility? Sure, I'm going to put it up front. It's a very loaded and big question, but let me try and deal with it. When we deal with issues of race, gender, harassment, etc., and diversity in general, we deal with it as a form of, I like to prefer to use the term inclusivity, rather than dealing with it as to say, is there any conduct happening here that doesn't promote inclusivity? Because if you have a racism issue, or you have a sexism issue, or a discrimination issue of any sort, My view is that it's got to do with a lack of culture of inclusivity. And my view is that in South Africa in particular, and that's why one of the reasons we raised this earlier on, as we think this is triggering incompatibility issues, if somebody's conduct is contrary to inclusivity in terms of race. In other words, the behavior could be construed as exclusive or prejudicial, if you don't even use the word racist, in the manner in which they deal with other people. That could be a big rub against the culture and values, and it should be a rub against the culture and values of any organization in South Africa, and that could be deemed to be a compatibility issue. So it may be something that you can't quite put your finger on in terms of this is racist behavior, but it could be that this person's just seems to not be compatible with a diverse, inclusive environment. And for that reason, they aren't compatible with our values and culture of our organization. I hope that helps, because that's how I like to look at these things. Rosita's asked, in a union demanding an incapacity route to be followed, and even in an investigation being conducted, there are no sufficient grounds to go the incapacity route. How does one settle the perceptions that the continued action from the union trying to pursue to take the workforce out on a strike on the matter? Now, first and foremost, conduct hearings and behavioral conduct. If to take action against an employee for behavioral issues or conduct issues or incapacity issues is the prerogative of an employer. The union plays an absolutely crucial role as, for want of a better term, a watchdog in the organization to point out areas of concern that their members or they may have in the way that certain managers may be conducting themselves, or certain policies are being affected, or in the way that certain people are behaving. And it's for incumbents on unions, and I think it's their role to, in fact, raise that with management where they believe there's a concern. Then it's incumbent on the employer to investigate or to interrogate that particular allegation and decide how to take it forward. In the event that the employer finds nothing to it, I would think that, and the union doesn't accept it, then there's maybe something more to the way that it's been communicated to the union. Alternatively, what the findings were. Alternatively, even more important, that could be the case, is that the investigation that took place in relation to the complaint from the union and its members may have not been inclusive of the union and their members' involvement. So in other words, the union feels that it was done without their inclusion and their input on why they feel aggrieved or they believe there's a problem. And my belief that is usually what leads to unions feeling still feeling aggrieved. Because certainly one would think that in the event that there is no basis, saying that there was an investigation and there's a conclusion that there's no basis to the complaint around incapacity of that particular manager, for example. What normally a good dispute resolution practitioner would do, and certainly what a Tokiso panelist would do, is they would give recommendations on how to deal with that perception. So they would try to unlock what caused that perception, be it an incorrect one, and give you recommendations on how to address it. And that's really where I think that could be coming from. And that's how it could be dealt with. Another question is, in this case, that's a follow-on question, that's why I'm going to take it. In this case, the union agreed to the terms of reference, choose an external party to investigate, and still not satisfied. So the union was involved in choosing determining the terms of reference, and were involved in choosing the external party and who was to investigate, and they're still unhappy with it. I would hope that that report was given to the union, and maybe what there could be done is maybe have a facilitated session with the union around the report to unpack it. That's how I would deal with it. But I never think, I always work from the premise, and this is from years of experience, is that I always work from the premise that grievances, problems, issues come from a place of truth, in the sense that people don't raise things because they're working with malafiders. People generally raise issues because they genuinely believe it, or there's an underlying problem to it. So it's a matter of trying to unpack where that is coming from, or that rejection of the report is coming from. Maybe that needs to be unpacked more. Okay, I've got another question from Giselle. And they're still coming in fast and furious, the questions. Incompatibility has been identified. However, in your company, you have a manager that the staff refuse to work with and have many pending grievances against him or her. He refuses to acknowledge that there is a problem, but in the interim, she is now identified as an affected employee in terms of the Section 189. She is not placed during the retrenchment. Can you have sufficient claims of damages under the Employment Equity Act based on victimization, based on arbitrary grounds? Now, you've got an employer who has a manager, lots of grievances, match of problems. They enter into a 189 process. He's identified to be retrenched, and he is retrenched, and there's a concern that because of all these grievances against them, it could be deemed to be that the 189 is being used to get rid of him. My view is that if the 189 process has been done appropriately, and it's been done objectively, fairly, with proper consultation, no decisions been made before proper and genuine consultations taken place, and the selection criteria is fair, there is no basis on which the employee can turn around and say victimization. So it depends on how that process was conducted and whether it was done appropriately and in a genuine manner. Coming back to, and we often see this, the overlap between grievances and incompatibility. When can you address somebody? When should you deal with grievances versus where you intend to bring incompatibility as operational requirements or misconduct issue against them? A lot of employers, and I think this is where you seek out advice and you look at process and you take an objective stand. Is it appropriate to deal with the grievances first before you take that stance? And that depends. It depends on a lot of factors. But it is often better to deal with grievances first before you move to the next step of dealing with the misconduct or the incompatibility issues. So you deal with the substantive issues and get those out the way before you actually move on to those other issues. But sometimes there is also a cause that one deals with them holistically and together. Okay, another question is, can frustrations lead to incompatibility? The employee can get frustrated to the extent that she withdraws their participation in a number of activities, and this is not in the KPI in an organization. How can that employee be helped? Well, if an employee is frustrated, they need to raise it with their managers, or the manager, where they see frustration, needs to raise it with the employee and find out what is causing the frustration before it leads to formal grievances or formal disciplinary action or formal incompatibility proceedings. But yes, I could see that happening. But I would think that incompatibility is a no-fault thing, and it depends where the frustration is lying from. But if that frustration is manifesting in bad conduct by the employee, I would think that is why, even more so, employers should try to deal with conflict as early on as possible. So you can identify what is the cause of that frustration that's manifesting in that conduct, and deal with that rather than just dealing with the conduct itself. Then you can deal with employees better. That doesn't justify bad conduct in any way. I'm not suggesting that at all, but it certainly may see you as, if you are an employer, certainly dealing with the conflict and dealing with the cause of that particular frustration. But yeah, I could see those overlapping sometimes. Last couple of questions we're going to get to. a couple of thoughts. If the employee, it's from Claire, has a mental illness but doesn't allow the employer access to this information or denies this, then the employee will have to live with the consequences, i.e. the employer will deal with the manifestations of this illness with the limited information at the employer's disposal. 100%, it will result in the consequences, be it absenteeism, be it poor performance, be it improper conduct, insubordination. Anyway, we tend to find that ill health, if it's not dealt with as ill health, will invariably rear its head in other forms of conduct or performance issues. So yes, and then the employee can't, and there was a case, I'll give you a practical example, is that an employee was dismissed for constantly being absent from work. The employer raised, said, is there some ill health issue? Refused to disclose, refused to do anything. And they got dismissed for always being absent from work and always never being present, or and not, just never coming to work. They go to the arbitration at the CCMA. They say, well, I'm HIV positive, and the employer did not reasonably accommodate me. The employer went, we didn't know. We didn't know. They didn't disclose it. We actually went and asked if there was a problem we need to be aware of that we could assist with. And of course, that dismissal was found to be fair, because the employer can't be held to account when to deal with it as an ill health and try to reasonably accommodate the employee in the event when they didn't know about it. So that's a very kind of clear-cut example of why it's important employees bring it to the attention of the employer that when they do have a problem with ill health or an incapacity matter, because then the employer has an obligation to reasonably accommodate them in that particular workplace. Okay. Another one I've got is Teresa's asking, requiring Zoom, etc., and laptops, can that requirement not resort under operational requirements under certain circumstances, depending on the kind of industry? Absolutely. And that was the last, the technophobe example as well. And also incompatibility at work is where somebody's not engaging with technology to communicate. Absolutely, it can be dealt with in operational requirements, because the employer, the interesting thing, and the question I have, and I'd have to give it more thought, is that generally speaking, you're saying, well, this is our operational requirements. We require you to work from home. It's the new workplace. It's the new place of work. And if you're unable to meet this operational requirements, or we're unable to reasonably accommodate you anywhere else, we will have to go the 189 route. So yes, I think it could potentially be deemed a operational requirements issue. But I also think it could potentially be an incompatible matter as well, where somebody's just unable to engage, or where they're unable to manage their own time. They're unable to engage and manage. They might, for example, be a micromanager. So it's more to do with their style as an individual. Is no longer compatible with the values and culture, the remote work culture of the organization. I'm going to wrap it up with the one last question. Is on the probation question, wouldn't 181J of the Code of Good Practice help here? The reasons could be less compelling. Absolutely. You don't need much less compelling reasons to dismiss during or not to confirm employment to a probationary period. So on that note, on the probationary note, we've still got a few more questions coming through, but I'm going to cut it there. Very, very interesting topic. Watch this space. I've got a feeling over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see more and more jurisprudence around and examples of incompatibility dismissals coming to the fore through Tokiso, at the CCMA, and at our labour courts. So thank you very much. On that issue of how do you measure KPIs and how do you incorporate it, Anita's question, we will get back to you, Anita, on that specifically. If you're keen to know more about that, please do send us a note and let us know if you'd like some more information on that, and we'll send you that. And maybe, even maybe, that could be one of our next topics at one of our webinars. So thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe and stay well.